Hello, this is Professor Gillian, and today we're going to be discussing factors that impact gas exchange. Now, gas exchange, if you recall, is the movement of gas from inside the capillary and out into the tissue, or vice versa, from the tissue into the capillary. It also occurs in the lungs. So, in the lungs, the gases are moving from the air and into the bloodstream, or from the bloodstream and into the air. Last time we looked at one important factor that impacts gas exchange, and that was the partial pressure gradient. So we talked about how the partial pressure gradient will determine the direction of movement of the gases. They will move from higher partial pressure to lower partial pressure. And it also impacts how quickly it will diffuse. So if it's a steep partial pressure gradient, then it will diffuse more quickly. And if the gradient is not as steep, then the diffusion occurs more slowly. Another factor that will impact gas exchange is how soluble the gas is in water. So obviously this is going to have an impact if something is moving into the bloodstream. So carbon dioxide is much more soluble than oxygen. It dissolves in water or in the blood much more easily than the oxygen does. On the other hand, oxygen has a much steeper partial pressure gradient. So between the two of these things, they sort of equal out. Carbon dioxide is much more soluble, and oxygen has a much steeper partial pressure gradient. And in the end, oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged in equal amounts. Something else that will impact gas exchange is how thick the respiratory membrane is. So typically the respiratory membrane is very thin. Remember that it's made up of simple squamous endothelial cells lining the capillaries, the simple squamous cells lining the alveoli, and a shared basement membrane. So this is not a large obstacle for these gases to diffuse across. Remember, these squamous cells are flat; they're sort of shaped like fried eggs. So it's going to diffuse across that thin portion from one to the other. However, if something occurs to thicken that respiratory membrane, that will inhibit gas exchange. So the picture here on the bottom where it's labeled as pneumonia, what you see going on here is that there's fluid accumulating in the alveoli of the lungs. And as this fluid accumulates, notice the thickness of the respiratory membrane. There's a greater distance for these gases to diffuse across. So here you can see the respiratory membrane is quite thin normally, and here in the case of pneumonia, you can see that the respiratory membrane gets thicker due to the buildup of fluid across the walls. So here the gas has to diffuse a short distance, and here the gas is diffusing a much greater distance. Another factor that will impact gas exchange is the membrane surface area. So the gas will diffuse across the surface of the alveoli or the surface of the capillary, and if there is not as much surface area, there's not as many places for the gases to diffuse across. So for example, look at this bottom picture here that shows what the lungs look like in a person who has emphysema. So what's going on with emphysema is that the alveolar walls are breaking down. And with these alveolar walls breaking down, there's not as much surface area. So there's not as many places for these gases to diffuse across in order for gas exchange to take place. So if the surface area decreases, then that will inhibit gas exchange. You can see up here in the normal lungs that there's a lot of surface area typically in a healthy lung. So the next concept of something that will impact gas exchange is called ventilation perfusion coupling. And I think just the title of this concept can throw students off. But if you stop and think about what they mean, it's not too bad, and it makes a lot of sense. So consider what ventilation means. Ventilation is referring to the airflow moving in and out of the lungs. Now, perfusion. Perfusion is a topic that we hit in our cardiovascular system chapters. Perfusion is talking about the amount of blood flow for the amount of tissue. So an organ that is well perfused gets a very healthy amount of blood flow, a lot of blood flow. And if it's not very well perfused, that means it's getting a scanty amount of blood flow. So this is called ventilation perfusion coupling. And when you think of couple, think of them going together. So the ventilation matches the perfusion, and the perfusion will match the ventilation.